Hello everyone, this is Eye on Africa for Friday, December 17th. Here are the headlines. A major sex abuse scandal in Gabon. The former coach for the country's under-17 football team is accused of sexually abusing dozens of underage players for several years. Hundreds gather in Tunisia to mark 11 years since the start of the revolution. This time, though, there is growing opposition against President SAED. And the UN Human Rights Council says it will be sending investigators to Ethiopia to look into widespread allegations of human rights abuses from all sides involved in the year-long conflict. Authorities in Gabon have opened a probe into allegations of sex abuse against young football players, according to a 2-year-long investigation published in The Guardian. Patrick Assoumou-Eyi, a former coach for the country's under-17 football team, sexually abused young players. He's also accused of grooming some of them and of blackmailing them, offering them a place on the team in exchange for sexual favors. Eyi, who is now the technical director for the country's main football league, has been suspended. Earlier, one of the journalists involved in this investigation joined us to talk about some of what he uncovered.
The ring started out in the 1990s. Patrick Assoumou-Eyi has occupied a number of positions in Gabonese football, in academies, clubs, but also the national team. He's now technical director of the country's highest league and has abused several hundreds of young players, but also provided underage players to other abusers within Gabon's football circle. When we published the article yesterday, so many people reacted on social media, some saying that their brother had been abused or that they themselves were dropped from their team because they'd refused to be abused. It shows that everyone knows what's been going on this whole time. We'll publish more names in The Guardian in the months to come. Over the course of the 2.5 years that we spent on the investigation, we found that over 15 people are involved. From Europe to Asia or South America, it's endemic. There isn't a continent that isn't affected by this. The problem is that authorities have been closing their eyes for decades on what we say is the biggest taboo in the sporting world. Thousands of youngsters' lives are being ruined by male and female predators. I want to thank all the Gabonese boys and girls who spoke to me. The country should be proud of them, and I think that this will set a precedent for the world of sports, because this is the first time that we're actually talking about this abuse on such a scale.
Hundreds of people took part in rival demonstrations in Tunisia this Friday. Both supporters and opponents of President Kais Saied gathered in Tunis to mark the anniversary of the 2011 revolution, which ultimately overthrew the country's leaders but failed to resolve economic and social issues. Earlier this week, the president prolonged the suspension of parliament until elections are held next December, a decision which has left Tunisians divided.
اللي هم الشعب الكادح اللي ماهوش لاقي حقه جملة اللي هو يناضل على الخبزة وعلى صغاره وعلى داره فهمني ماهوش واصل هذاك عليه ماشي مع السيد الرئيس.
حتى في القانون الدستوري بتاعنا ما يتحلش البرلمان ما يتحلش وما يتمسش يبقى في حالة انعقاد هو جاء كسر البرلمان.
Well, earlier we spoke to France 24's Fadil Ali Reza. He explains how there is now mounting opposition against the president, who until recently was massively popular.
We're seeing more and more of these sort of institutions in Tunisia, political institutions, not just the parties, but also unions, really putting themselves against Kais Saied, saying that he's taking too long, that he's delaying. Even his former supporters are saying he's taking too long. Of course, we've also seen that people who are supportive of Kais Saied, some of his base today in Sidi Bouzid. Of course, today is the 11th anniversary of the beginning of Tunisia's revolution, which started in the rural area of Sidi Bouzid. In the town there, people were celebrating, but there were also people who were protesting, particularly for socioeconomic reasons, which, since July, we haven't seen a lot of movement from the president on some of the key issues that are affecting Tunisia. He's really focused on trying to do constitutional reforms, trying to do an entirely different political system. And many of these decisions have come quite slowly, even for his supporters. So we saw people saying that they would like to see an expansion of, for example, public sector recruitment of university graduates. This comes at a time when the government is actually in negotiations with the IMF, and there are expectations that there may be even more cutting back on public spending, something that will certainly exacerbate some of the socioeconomic issues that even Kais Saied supporters have been talking about in the streets.
French President Emmanuel Macron has cancelled next week's trip to Mali. He was set to meet transitional leader Colonel Assimi Goïta in Bamako before heading to Gao to meet French troops stationed there. According to the Élysée Palace, the trip was cancelled due to the ongoing surge in COVID cases in France. The UN Human Rights Council has agreed to send international investigators to Ethiopia as warnings of generalized violence continue. The 47 member states narrowly decided to open the probe into a wide range of alleged violations by all sides in the year-long conflict. Ethiopia's government has slammed the decision, saying the vote was, quote, being used as an instrument of political pressure and that it had been hijacked by a neo-colonialist mentality. The decision came after both the UN and dozens of countries voiced alarm at alleged atrocities such as mass killings and sexual violence, and that has also had a disastrous impact on the humanitarian situation on the ground.
The humanitarian impact of the conflict is increasingly dramatic. Acute food insecurity now affects more than 9.4 million people in northern Ethiopia, according to OCHA. Within Tigray, 5.2 million people, that is roughly 90% of the population, are in need. Only limited UN-organized humanitarian supplies have been able to enter Tigray since July, including food and vital medical supplies.
The UN Refugee Agency says clashes between herders, fishermen, and farmers in northern Cameroon have forced at least 100,000 people to flee their homes in the past 2 weeks. The UNHCR is calling the situation a humanitarian emergency. 85,000 of those displaced people have fled into neighboring Chad. The agency and humanitarian partners say they're rushing to the scene to deliver assistance. A spokesperson for the agency says the vast majority of new arrivals into Chad were children and 98% of the adults were women. The clashes broke out over access to dwindling water resources. A court in Madagascar has convicted 6 people over a plot to kill President André Ratswell, handing them various sentences. Paul Rafanourana, who according to local media was once an advisor to the president, was handed the highest punishment, 20 years prison with forced labor. The High Court judge said the 6 were guilty of plotting to overthrow the government, as well as of criminal association with a view to threatening the president's life. All 6 had denied the charges. In the Ivory Coast, university students are protesting over an unusual reason. They believe they should be allowed to go on holiday as soon as their exams are done, and that has led to some violent protests. Hanan Ferjani and Samuel Bernard have this report.
Dozens of youths storming out of their classroom and out of their school to avoid being stoned or hit by their peers. Similar scenes have been reported in multiple establishments across Ivory Coast. Behind the violent images, one recurring phenomenon. In the last 3 years, as the end of each semester neared, groups of students would systematically impose schools to close early by forcing everyone out. In 2019, this private high school located in Abidjan had to interrupt its programming because of riots.
Some people came to kick us out of our classrooms because they wanted to go on leave ahead of time. Some of our friends were stoned and got hurt.
It was a shock for me because our program for the academic year was set, but we went on leave early and missed out on some subjects.
Beyond sanctioning rioters, the government has launched an awareness campaign across schools this year. Parent organizations have also gotten involved with grassroots initiatives. Their method, creating a sense of belonging for students with positive messages.
We tell them that disrupting the class is wrong, but we don't really tell them what to do. That's why our approach here is to explain why it should matter to them to get a good and stable education.
According to experts, the early leave phenomenon is merely a symptom of a deep-seated educational crisis in the country. In 2019, an NGO called Social Justice reported that nearly 20% of children abandon school before completing their primary education. For this sociologist, it is the system itself that needs remodeling.
You have to look at this early leave thing from a social perspective. A child should not impose his or her wishes on elders or society. But does going to school really guarantee work for these students? That's the fundamental question.
A question that is being discussed as part of a General Assembly on education. It remains to be seen what concrete action plan will be put forth when the meetings conclude this coming February.
Let's take you now to South Africa. It's one of the only countries where the lion population is on the rise. That's largely thanks to small parks, which protect about 700 big cats nationwide. But the prides must be carefully managed to avoid overpopulation and inbreeding. Laurent Bersacher has more.
The surgery took almost 4 hours. It was delayed due to the patient's swollen intestines, as she was still digesting last night's zebra. Once sterilized, this young lioness was released in a natural reserve to the east of Pretoria. It was an invasive but necessary procedure to help control the population of these big cats and prevent inbreeding.
Any time from now forward, they will start coming on heat, and they would end up mating with their own fathers. So that's why we need to prevent that. In the natural circumstances, that wouldn't happen because the males would have been displaced by other males.
These 9 lions live in a natural reserve ripe with prey and with very few hostile species that would normally compete for food, such as cheetahs and hyenas. A plentiful setting for these felines, which would rapidly multiply and eat through the reserve if left to their own devices. In 2010, conservationists set up the Lion Management Forum in South Africa to help control their reproduction rates.
In total, have about 700 lions. That is increasing at roughly about 2% a year. If we didn't do the management that we were doing in that place, the population will be increasing at 22% a year. Now that sounds really nice, but the trouble is I don't have lots of space for that in South Africa.
While the global lion population has dropped by over 40% in the past 2 decades, in South Africa it's been steadily increasing, thanks in large part to the conservation efforts of these small natural reserves.
And that does it for this edition of Eye on Africa. Thank you very much for watching. Stay tuned to France 24.